Hey guys, hey Patreon viewers. So there's a little video looking at a new acquisition I managed to lay my hands on. Obviously I am both an antique collector and dealer a bit, and additionally obviously a fencing instructor studying military sabre. So obviously a lot of my stuff focuses on sabres. I'm really sorry for those of you who watch my channel primarily for other stuff. I know that I spend a lot of time looking at sabre, but it's my main focus, so I'm sorry for that. It's one of the things I find most interesting. But for those of you who are interested in military sabre, both antiques and the actual fencing, so the new acquisition is this. Okay, so it is a gymnasium sabre, but it is specifically the British 1895 pattern gymnasium sabre, which is based on, or really it's a copy of, the Masiello gymnasium sabre. Now, who was Masiello? Well, a lot of you will know, if you're into this topic, you will know this either from your own independent studies or from reading my articles or perhaps even some of my past videos. But essentially Masiello, Ferdinand Masiello, was a Florentine, i.e. from Florence, fencing instructor, sabre fence. Well, in fact, not just sabre, in fact he did foil as well, but fencing instructor who essentially was not recruited, but kind of hired, contracted to create a new system for the British Army in 1895. And there was a new model of sword, a new type of blade that had come in 1892, which I've written articles about. If you look on the Eastern Antique Arms website, then you can find an article about the 1892, 95, 97 infantry officers' swords. And I think it's kind of interesting, and it also relates to sabre kind of mindset or methodology and design right the way across Europe to some degree. It's not just Britain, because there's interconnected themes with French sword development and fencing, and indeed very strongly with Italian as well, to a lesser degree with German, although a bit there also, and Spain. But essentially a new system came in that was more thrust-centric. Well, it was a thrust-centric blade, so the new system was therefore more thrust-centric. It has to be said, Masiello's own method is not massively thrust-centric. It's what some people would call a dueling sabre system, although that's a bit of that's a misnomer, really. Even as Chris Holtzman, who wrote the book, the modern book on Italian dueling sabre, who I know, admits himself, he used that for marketing terms. Really, there's no differentiation in Italy between dueling sabre and military sabre. But because Italy's military experience in the late 19th century was very different to Britain's, if you look at what Italy was doing, well, it had its wars of unification, and then there was sort of minor European conflicts, and a tiny bit at the end of the 19th century, a tiny bit of colonial conflict in Ethiopia, but really that was right at the end of the 19th century and doesn't seem to have had any major part to play on swords and swordsmanship. Whereas in Britain, the mindset of swordsmanship was very inextricably linked with Britain's empire. So the three main areas really that governed British mindset as regards to the cold steel, bayonets and swords and lances, were India, the Sudan specifically, not so much South Africa, I'll mention that in a minute, and Afghanistan. Now obviously Afghanistan and India are connected because what's now Pakistan used to be part of India, and it borders onto Afghanistan. So the so-called northwest frontier was simply the connection between Britain's empire in India and Afghanistan, which at various points Afghanistan sometimes was under puppet rulers of the British Empire and sometimes wasn't. And so there was a lot of military goings on in Afghanistan. And for anybody who doesn't know, Afghanistan was essentially the playground of Britain and Russia. Britain and Russia, two big imperial opponents of the 19th century, who, much like in the 20th century, it has to be said, so if we look at the Cold War, we see wars in Iran and Iraq and Vietnam and other places, Korea, that are essentially a war between the West and communism. In the 19th century, it was a similar thing. There was a proxy war between Russia and Britain, sometimes directly, for example, in the Crimean War, but also sometimes indirectly, for example, in Afghanistan. So sometimes whether there was or whether there wasn't, there was a feeling in Britain, in the British government, that Russia was a threat to their empire in India via Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was hotly contested battleground, essentially, which is one of the reasons that it's such a fucked up place today, is thanks to the British Empire and thanks to Russia. So, you know, those empires have a lot to answer for, as we well know. So I don't want anyone to think that I glorify those things. I'm very interested in the colonial period, but you know, I don't necessarily, I don't at all condone a lot of the things that were done. Some of the things were okay, some of the things were horrific. So I just kind of view it neutrally, okay? So coming back to the swords, wow, that was a massive tangent. But I know that you, as my Patreon viewers, you might not mind that. You get some extra waffle from me. But back to the swords. So in 1895, that was a massive tangent. I think that was one of the biggest tangents I've done in a long time. In 1895, a new system came into the British Army, the infantry sword exercise of 1895, which I've got an original copy of, and you can buy facsimile copies of. And essentially, this was the practice weapon for it, which was modelled on Masiello's own practice weapon. As mentioned, Masiello's own system was a cut and thrust system, but the British Army system, because the 1892 blade with the updated 1895 hilt, I do have one. That is an amazing coincidence. I actually have an 1895 here. Okay, so there you go, with a thrusting blade. That was amazingly unplanned. But there you go, thrusting blade, new steel hilt that replaced the type of brass hilted cut and thrust curved blade that I normally show. And so it's a thrust-centric sword, so they had it as a thrust-centric system. So what you see in the British 1895 manual is not exactly Masiello. It is Masiello's system, but it's not what he necessarily exactly puts down in his 1887 book, which is Italian. It's slightly modified, and I believe it's more thrust-centric. I actually only really know the British work. I haven't really studied Masiello's earlier 1887 work. But this is the practice weapon for it. And what this replaced, essentially, was this. So this was the earlier, I've got several of these, but I've just pulled one out at random. This is the 1864 pattern gymnasium sabre. And as you can see, it's what looks like a beefier blade. In fact, the total weight of these two weapons is not really any different, but the back end, in other words the hilt of the Masiello sabre, or the 1895 gymnasium sabre, is heavier. It's a bigger guard, it's got a thicker well, it has a backstrap. In fact, this one doesn't have a backstrap. It's got a thick backstrap and a sort of fairly weighty pommel, and a big, very protective guard. And this means that the point of balance is way back there. It's only about, what is that, like 5 centimetres from, notice I use metric there, 5 centimetres from the guard, whereas the earlier 1864 balances out here, which is like, what is that, about 13 centimetres, something like that. I seem to remember I've measured it, actually, 13 centimetres, which is the same weight and balance as the real service sword of the time. As it happens, this was one of the criticisms of the 1895 gymnasium sword, and in fact the 1895 system, was that Masiello specifically says in the book, he says what you want is a sabre that balances really close to the hilt. I think he says like 2 fingers away from the hilt or something like that. I might be making that up, but he says close to the hilt. And one of the, I'll write an article about this. In fact, it is contained within that article on Eastern Antique Arms. I'll put the link below. There is a criticism, in fact there's several criticisms in newspapers of the time where they basically point out, look, why is the practice weapon different from the actual service weapon? Because the 1895 pattern service sword doesn't balance that closely to the hilt and doesn't handle very like the gymnasium sabre. So whilst this is a nice practice weapon, it's actually not so close to the service sword as the 1864 pattern was to the service sword of that time. So this, incidentally, is the sort of practice weapon that Waite would have been using, and Hutton in his earlier works, and various other people of the sort of up until 1895, basically, from about the middle of the 19th century. Although this is the 1864 pattern, and this specific design was patented, if you like, and drawn up and specified in 1864, similar examples did exist before that date of this type. So there we go, really, just to compare the 1864 with the 1895 gymnasium swords. They are very different things and you use them in a very, very different way. Just to focus finally on the 1895, it is very light at the tip. Now, some people, particularly in Italian, so Chris Holtzman and his buddies doing the kind of Italian dueling sabre, often bang on about the fact, so people like me doing British military sabre, or French people doing French military sabre, or even American military sabre, often go, oh yeah, but the Italian stuff, it moves in a different way, and the practice weapons are, we often describe them as light, and Chris and that will come back and go, no, look at the weights, blah blah blah. Now, one of my counters to that is that I understand what the Victorian sources mean when they complain about the lightness of Italian practice swords, and it's not literal lightness. What they mean is inertia. They're talking about inertia, how it feels in the hand. So quite simply, as mentioned, because this is very back weighted, very back heavy, it means that when you hold the sword, the tip is incredibly quick and easy to move around. It doesn't hit with any real force. Now, for a practice weapon, you could say that's a good thing, okay? Because it means you don't have to wear so much heavy padding, you don't have to wear so much protective gear. It's safer, in theory, less likely to break your fingers, less likely to give you concussion through a fencing mask, all that kind of stuff. The 1864 hits with very much more force. Now, these weigh about the same. Why is that? Well, quite simply, point of balance and weight distribution. You can quite clearly see on the camera that this sword has a big wide blade and this has a little narrow blade. Now, while the total weight's the same, the weight distribution is completely different. So yes, this is a weapon that's easier to train with for longer, and in fact the Italian sources list that as a virtue, as a good thing, because you could practice for longer with these. They hit less hard, but they are less similar to some types of service sword which have more meat in the blade. So when the Victorian sources describe these as light, that's what they mean. They mean light in the blade. They don't necessarily mean literally as a total just lump, as a weight. They don't mean lighter. Anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting. I will talk more about this. I'm going to do some restoration on this because this is dirty and got some rust and stuff and needs cleaning up. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.